My name's James, I'm 36, and if you had told me 5 years ago that one single family barbecue would change the entire course of my life, I would have laughed it off. But sometimes, the smallest remark, the kind people think is just a joke, cuts so deep it rearranges everything you thought you knew about yourself, your marriage, and the people around you. For me, it was the moment when my wife's brother leaned across the picnic table, sneered at me in front of the whole family, and said, "If you vanish tomorrow, no one would even notice." Everyone erupted in laughter like it was the funniest line they'd ever heard, everyone except me. I raised my drink, smirked, and replied with just 2 words, "We'll see." That night, while the laughter still echoed in my head, I packed my things and disappeared. But let me rewind a little. To understand that night, you need to understand the lead up. My wife's family was complicated. They weren't cruel in any obvious way, not the type you'd see screaming at each other in public or throwing plates across the room. Their brand of toxicity was quieter, subtle digs dressed as humor, favoritism hidden behind tradition, and a deep sense that I was always on the outside, no matter how much effort I put into fitting in. My wife, Claire, came from a family that thrived on appearances. Sunday dinners at her parents' house were practically mandatory. Barbecues were an annual event that no one could miss, and holidays were treated less like moments to cherish and more like performances to be critiqued. I knew all this going in, but when you're in love, you tell yourself it's not that bad. You learn to brush off the comments, smile when they mock your career choices, and laugh when they roll their eyes at your hobbies. For years, I played along. I thought it was what you did when you married into a family that didn't quite know what to make of you. The first time I realized I was considered expendable was about 2 years into our marriage. I'd lost my job during a round of company layoffs, and though I quickly found part-time work to keep things afloat, her family never let me forget it. At one dinner, her mother said, "At least Claire has a degree to fall back on," even though I had one too. Her father added, "You'll figure it out eventually, James," like I was some teenager who hadn't yet decided what to do with his life. Claire insisted they were just trying to encourage me, but encouragement doesn't usually sound like a pat on the head and a reminder of how little you matter. I brushed it off, telling myself it was temporary, that once I landed on my feet again, things would shift. And I did land on my feet. I worked hard, got a stable job, and even saved enough for Claire and me to put a down payment on a modest house. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough to rewrite the image they had of me as the guy who got lucky marrying their daughter. The barbecue that summer was supposed to be a celebration. Her father's birthday, everyone gathered in the backyard, the grill smoking, kids running around with sparklers. I remember standing there, holding a plate of food I wasn't really hungry for, when the conversation turned, as it often did, towards subtle jabs. Claire's brother, Matt, was the ringleader. He was the kind of guy who wore his arrogance like cologne, so strong you could smell it before he opened his mouth. He'd done well for himself financially, or at least that's what he wanted everyone to think. His stories were always just a little too polished, his achievements always timed perfectly to overshadow anything anyone else had done. That night, after I'd made a comment about how the ribs turned out better than last year, Matt leaned back, smirked, and said, "If James vanished tomorrow, no one would even notice." The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was the way everyone else burst out laughing. Even Claire. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Maybe she thought it was just family humor. But in that moment, it felt like confirmation of every suspicion I'd had for years. I wasn't family. I was a prop in their play, a punchline in their script. And I'd finally had enough. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I smiled, raised my drink like I was toasting, and said, "We'll see." They laughed harder, thinking I was playing along. But when the sun went down and the party ended, I went home, quietly packed a duffel bag, and walked out. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. The thing about disappearing is that it's both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying, because you realize just how much of your identity is tied to being known by others. Liberating, because once you step away, you get to decide who you are without their voices in your ear. I didn't know what my future looked like that night, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be the man who stood there and took it anymore. And that's where the story really begins, because leaving was only the first step. What came after was a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything they thought they knew about me and everything I thought I knew about them. But that night at the barbecue, that was the spark. The moment I decided I'd had enough of being invisible. The moment I decided that if they wanted to see what life was like without me, I'd show them. When I look back now, I realized the barbecue wasn't some isolated moment of cruelty. It was just the loudest example of a pattern that had been simmering for years. My name is James, I'm 36, and though I've always considered myself patient, even easygoing, there's only so many times a person can be brushed aside, dismissed, or laughed at before something inside you cracks. The barbecue was the breaking point, but the tension leading up to it had been building steadily, brick by brick, every family gathering, every offhand remark, every time Claire's family made it clear that I wasn't really one of them. The earliest cracks showed up around holidays. Thanksgiving at her parents' house was like a carefully choreographed performance. Her mother would seat everyone in their rightful places, her father at the head of the table, Matt to his right, Claire across from him, and me, always down near the end, next to whichever cousin didn't bring a date that year. It sounds small, but the message was obvious. I was peripheral, not the core, not someone who mattered enough to sit close, to be part of the laughter and stories that circled around the top of the table. When I brought it up once, half-jokingly to Claire, she told me I was imagining things. It's just how Mom does it, she said. But I knew better. People make room for those they value. They push the others aside. It wasn't just the seating, though. Every accomplishment of mine was minimized or ignored, while Matt's were treated like golden milestones. When I got promoted at work, Claire's father shrugged and said, "That's good, though nothing like Matt's new investment firm, of course." When I finally paid off the used car I'd been driving for years, her mother said, "Well, Matt bought a brand new SUV last month." I wasn't in a competition with him, but it was made very clear that they saw one whether I entered it or not. And in their eyes, I was always a distant second. I remember the sting of smiling politely, forcing myself to swallow the bitterness while everyone else clapped Matt on the back like he was some conquering hero. Then there were the favors. Matt could do no wrong, and his requests were treated as obligations for everyone else. When he needed help moving into his new condo, everyone cleared their schedules. When I asked for a hand fixing up our fence, Claire's dad told me, "Maybe hire a professional, James. It'll save everyone the trouble." It was such a small sentence, but the way he said it, like I was incapable, like my needs weren't worth the effort, dug deep. It was the same tone they all used when I tried to insert myself into their conversations, the same dismissive nod they gave when I spoke up with an idea or an opinion. Like I wasn't really there. Like I could vanish, and, just as Matt eventually said out loud, no one would notice. The manipulation was worse when it came to Claire. Her family knew how to twist her emotions like a dial on a radio, always tuning her into their frequency. When I suggested skipping one of the endless family dinners so we could have a quiet weekend to ourselves, her mother would call Claire directly. "Oh, we were so looking forward to seeing you," she'd say in that sweet, guilt-soaked voice. "It just wouldn't feel right without you." The implication was clear. If we missed even one dinner, Claire would be letting them down. And if Claire let them down, it would be my fault. So we went, week after week, holiday after holiday. I became the outsider who had to play along because saying no meant making Claire feel like she was betraying them. There was one evening, a Christmas dinner, that still stands out to me. I had worked late shifts all week, exhausted, running on fumes, but I didn't want to ruin the holiday for Claire. When we sat down at her parents' dining table, I noticed her mother had arranged the plates with fancy name cards. Everyone had theirs carefully scripted in gold ink. Everyone except me. In my spot was a plain plate. No card, no decoration. When I asked lightly if mine had gotten lost, Matt piped up, "Guess they ran out of names worth writing." The table erupted in laughter. Even Claire chuckled, though she touched my hand like it was supposed to soften the sting. I laughed too, or at least pretended to, but inside I burned. It wasn't about the card. It was about what it represented, that I was never going to be more than a footnote in their story, no matter how much effort I gave. I told myself I could handle it if I just kept my head down, but the truth is, every remark piled up. Every time they cut me out of conversations or reminded me of Matt's greatness, it was another brick on the wall they were building between me and them. I tried to talk to Claire about it more than once, but she always downplayed it. "That's just how they are," she'd say. Or worse, "Don't take it so seriously. You're being too sensitive." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was sensitive. But sensitivity doesn't make the cut hurt less. It makes it sharper. The worst moment before the barbecue happened just a few weeks prior. Claire and I had hosted a small dinner at our house. Something simple, just spaghetti and wine, to celebrate our third wedding anniversary. We'd invited her parents and Matt, hoping for a quieter, more intimate evening. Halfway through dinner, I stepped into the kitchen to refill the wine, and I overheard her mother whispering to Claire, "You know, honey, you could have done so much better. Matt says his colleague David is still single. You remember David, right? Handsome, stable, from a good family. It's never too late to think about your future." Claire brushed her off, insisting she was happy, but the words still pierced me. It didn't matter that I wasn't supposed to hear. The fact that it was said at all confirmed what I had always feared. They didn't just dislike me. They didn't think I deserved to be there at all. That's why Matt's vanished comment at the barbecue hit harder than it should have. It wasn't just a cruel joke. It was the culmination of years of being treated like a shadow in my own marriage, a guest in a family I was supposed to belong to. When they laughed, I saw every holiday, every dinner, every moment of being pushed aside flash in front of me. And I knew, in that instant, that their laughter wasn't harmless. It was a reflection of how they truly saw me. Replaceable, invisible, disposable. That night, while they were still replaying Matt's joke in their heads like a clever punchline, I was at home, zipping up my duffel bag. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally deciding I wouldn't let them define me anymore. I wasn't running away, I was stepping out of their shadow. And though I didn't know what the future would look like, I knew one thing for certain. My absence would speak louder than any words I could have said. And that's where the tension truly began to sharpen. Because once you disappear, people notice things they never expected to lose. I thought the barbecue was the worst of it. I thought, foolishly, that the years of small humiliations, quiet dismissals, and constant comparisons had already peaked. But I was wrong. The truth is, there's always a deeper cut waiting when you're dealing with people who thrive on diminishing others. My name is James. I'm 36, and the real betrayal, the kind that hollowed me out and made me realize there was no going back, didn't come at a dinner table or a holiday gathering. It came quietly, like most betrayals do, sliding into my life when I least expected it. It was about 2 weeks after the barbecue. Claire and I had barely spoken about it since. When I tried to bring it up, to explain how deeply Matt's words had cut, she sighed and waved it off. "James, it was a joke. You're overthinking this. You can't keep taking everything so personally." I wanted to argue, to shout that it wasn't just a joke, it was years of jokes at my expense, but I bit my tongue. Part of me hoped she'd eventually see it from my side. Another part knew she wouldn't. Still, I stayed. I wasn't ready to blow up my marriage over her family's cruelty. Not yet. Then came the betrayal. Claire had left her phone on the kitchen counter one evening while she showered. I wasn't snooping. I had no intention of looking. But when the screen lit up with a new message, the preview stopped me cold. It was from her mother. "Don't let James drag you down with him. You deserve someone who lifts you up." My chest tightened. Against my better judgment, I opened the thread. What I found wasn't just one message, it was months of them. Messages from her mother, her father, and even Matt, all gently chipping away at me behind my back. "James will never provide the way Matt could. You don't want to waste your best years playing house with someone who can't keep up. Think about what life would be like if you had married someone with ambition." And worst of all, Claire's responses. She didn't defend me. She didn't tell them to stop. She didn't shut the door on their constant criticism. Instead, she replied with half-hearted excuses. "He's trying. He means well. He'll figure it out eventually." She wasn't standing by me. She was tolerating me. That realization stung more than anything her family had ever said, because it meant that, deep down, she might have believed them. I remember sitting at the table, staring at her phone, feeling like the floor had dropped out beneath me. It wasn't just that her family mocked me. It was that Claire let them. She allowed them to plant seeds of doubt about me, and maybe those seeds had taken root. For years, I had told myself she was caught in the middle, that she didn't know how to stand up to them. But now I saw the truth. She wasn't in the middle. She was leaning, quietly, toward their side. The next morning, I tested it. Over breakfast, I casually asked, "Do you ever regret marrying me?" She looked startled, then laughed softly, like I'd said something silly. "Of course not. Why would you ask that?" I wanted to push, to throw her own words from the messages in her face, but I swallowed it. Instead, I nodded, smiled, and told her I was just tired, just overthinking things. But inside, something shifted. The trust that had anchored me to her, fragile as it already was, cracked clean down the middle. The final straw came a few days later at another family dinner. I didn't want to go, but Claire insisted. It was her father's retirement party. It means a lot to him, she said, and so I agreed. I dressed neatly, plastered on a polite smile, and walked into their home with my guard already up. The night went smoothly at first, though I could feel the usual undercurrent of tension whenever Matt opened his mouth. Then, near the end of dinner, Claire's father stood to make a toast. He raised his glass, looked around the table, and began to thank everyone for their support over the years. He named each of his children, praised Matt for his business, complimented his daughter-in-law for her career, and even mentioned a cousin's volunteer work. Then he turned his gaze toward me. For a split second, I thought, naively, that maybe he'd acknowledge me, even just with a small kindness. Instead, he chuckled and said, "And of course, we're grateful for James. Proof that Claire has a generous heart." The table roared with laughter. My hands went cold around my glass. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what he'd just done, reduced me to charity. Not a husband, not a partner, just a burden Claire was magnanimous enough to carry. I looked at her, waiting for her to speak, to defend me, to tell her father that was cruel. But she didn't. She just smiled weakly and sipped her wine. That was the betrayal. Not just the words, but the silence that followed. The silence from the woman who was supposed to have my back. In that moment, I knew something in me had broken beyond repair. I didn't show it. I laughed along, clinked glasses, played the part. But inside, I was already packing my bags. Not just clothes this time, but everything. My dignity, my self-worth, and whatever strength I had left. Because when trust is gone, there's nothing left to hold on to. And when laughter turns into knives, the only way to survive is to step out of range. That night, as Claire slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her father's words again and again. Proof that Claire had a generous heart. Proof that I was nothing more than the punchline they all secretly believed me to be. And that's when the thought first took root. If I disappeared, truly disappeared, I wouldn't be the forgotten one. They would. Rock bottom doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It creeps in quietly, wearing the disguise of exhaustion, of numbness, of silence so thick you can't remember what your own voice used to sound like. My name's James, I'm 36, and after that retirement party, I slipped into a version of myself I barely recognized. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I stopped expecting. It was easier to play the role they had written for me than to keep fighting to prove I deserved a different one. The mornings were the worst. I would wake up next to Claire and wonder if she looked at me the way her parents did. I remembered those messages I'd read on her phone, the lukewarm defenses she'd offered when they tore me down. Did she see me as a man she loved, or as a responsibility she had to justify? Every smile she gave me, every casual, "I love you," I dissected for cracks. Was it real, or was it habit? My trust was gone, and without it, even the most ordinary gestures felt loaded with doubt. At work, I threw myself into long hours. Not because I loved the job, but because being in the office meant I didn't have to be home, didn't have to sit through dinners where Claire recounted her day while I nodded quietly, pretending I wasn't hollowed out inside. My coworkers started noticing. One of them, a friend named Sam, asked me if I was okay. "You look like you're carrying 1,000 pounds, he said once. I shrugged it off. How could I explain that the weight wasn't just work or stress? It was the slow erosion of who I thought I was. Even the house started to feel like it wasn't mine. I noticed how Claire would invite her family over without asking me, how she'd let Matt walk through the door like he owned the place. One Saturday, I came home from running errands and found Matt in my garage, rummaging through my tools. "Claire said I could borrow a few things," he said with a smirk, not even looking up. When I told him I needed those tools for a project, he waved me off. "You can buy new ones. Besides, you'll probably mess it up anyway." He left with half my set. Claire told me later not to make a big deal out of it. "He'll bring them back," she said. He didn't. And she didn't ask. That was when the house stopped feeling like a home. It was just walls, a roof, a place where I slept but no longer belonged. I started staying later at work, sometimes even falling asleep at my desk. It was easier to explain being tired to my boss than to explain being invisible to my wife. The quiet planning began as a whisper in the back of my mind. At first, it was just little thoughts. What if I took a weekend trip alone? What if I stopped showing up to family dinners? What if I just left? But whispers grow louder when you feed them. I started testing the idea of absence. Skipping a dinner with the excuse of overtime. Not answering the phone when Claire's mother called. Staying late enough at work that Claire was already asleep when I got home. Nobody really noticed. Nobody asked where I was. And in that neglect, I found a strange clarity. They had already shown me what life was like without me. One evening, I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to Claire on the phone in the kitchen. She was talking to her mother. "He's fine," she said, her tone distracted, like she was explaining the weather. "James is just quiet lately. I think he's tired." Her mother's voice carried faintly through the walls. "Well, maybe he'll come around. Or maybe he won't. You're strong enough to handle either way." Claire laughed softly, not in agreement exactly, but not in protest either. I sat there in the dark, my chest tight, realizing that no one, not even my wife, was afraid of losing me. That's when rock bottom hit. It wasn't a crash. It was a slow sinking, like quicksand, pulling me deeper each day until I could barely see the sky above. But even at the bottom, there was a spark, a voice inside me whispering, "If no one fears your absence, make them feel it." So I began to plan. Quietly, carefully. I started setting aside money from each paycheck into an account Claire didn't know about. I began looking at rentals in towns far enough away that I could disappear without a trace. I pared down my life, selling things on the side, keeping only what I knew I could carry. Every step was small, deliberate, hidden in plain sight. And with each move, I felt a sliver of control return. The night of the barbecue had been the spark. But this was the beginning of the fire. The part where I stopped begging to be seen and started preparing to vanish on my own terms. And as I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling beside a wife who didn't notice my silence, I made a promise to myself. If they thought I was invisible now, they hadn't seen anything yet. The funny thing about hitting rock bottom is that it clears the ground beneath you. There's nothing left to fall through, so every step afterward feels like climbing. My name's James, I'm 36, and after months of being the butt of jokes, the charity case, the man who wouldn't be missed, I finally started to rise. Not loudly, not with some grand announcement, but quietly, like a tide that comes in while no one is paying attention. It began with the money. For weeks, I had been siphoning off part of each paycheck into a private account. At first, it was just a trickle, barely noticeable, but over time it grew into something substantial. Watching the balance climb gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. That account wasn't just numbers, it was freedom. Freedom from Claire's parents' voices in my head, freedom from Matt's smirk, freedom from the dining tables where I sat as an afterthought. Every dollar was a brick in the foundation of the life I was quietly building for myself. The second step was my health. Years of stress had left me sluggish, worn down, the kind of man who dragged himself through the day instead of walking with purpose. But once I decided to plan my escape, something shifted. I joined a gym near my office. Not one of those fancy places Claire's family would scoff at, but a simple, no-frills spot where people came to sweat and leave. At first, I could barely last 20 minutes on the treadmill. But I kept going back, day after day. I added weights, built routines, and slowly, I began to see changes. My shoulders straightened. My energy returned. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't just see the tired, overlooked husband anymore. I saw someone sharper, stronger, someone with a spark in his eyes again. Work, too, became a place where I rose. Instead of burying myself in long hours to avoid home, I started channeling my energy into actual progress. I took on projects no one else wanted, stayed late not out of despair, but out of determination. My boss noticed. Promotions had always seemed reserved for other people than Matt types, but now, suddenly, I was being called into meetings, asked for my opinion, given responsibilities that mattered. I didn't brag about it at home. I didn't rush to tell Claire's family. This was mine. My victories, untainted by their dismissive laughter. And then came the network. Sam, my coworker who had once told me I looked like I was carrying the world on my shoulders, became an unexpected ally. He introduced me to friends of his, people outside my bubble, People who didn't know me as Claire's husband or Matt's brother-in-law. They knew me as James. We grabbed drinks. We talked about life. We laughed without anyone turning me into the punchline. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Truly seen. Claire noticed something was different, though she couldn't put her finger on it. One night, she asked, "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" I smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Just busy with work." And that was true, but not in the way she thought. I wasn't distant because I was slipping away. I was distant because I was building something new, something she and her family weren't part of. The more I grew, the less I needed their approval. And the less I needed their approval, the clearer my future became. The turning point of my rise came unexpectedly. I was at a small networking event Sam had dragged me to, half convinced I wouldn't fit in. But as I stood there, talking to people who knew nothing about my family, nothing about Claire, I realized I was thriving. I spoke with confidence. People laughed at my jokes, not at me, but with me. One man even pulled me aside and said, "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Ever think about starting something on your own?" The idea lit a fire in me. For years, I had been told I was second-rate, incapable, someone who would mess things up if given the chance. And here was a stranger who saw potential. That night, as I drove home, I gripped the steering wheel tighter and whispered to myself, "They were wrong about you. They've always been wrong." Back at home, the family dinners continued. I still attended, still played the quiet role, but now it was different. I wasn't crushed under their words anymore. When Matt bragged about his new SUV, I nodded, smiled, and thought about the gym session I crushed that morning. When Claire's father made a veiled jab about ambition, I smiled politely, knowing that at work, my name was being mentioned in rooms Matt could never enter. When her mother sighed about what Claire could have had, I kept my face neutral, my eyes calm, because deep inside, I knew I was no longer chained to their table. I was building something stronger than their approval, and I didn't need their laughter to validate me anymore. In fact, their laughter was becoming background noise, a soundtrack to my quiet transformation. The rise wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment of triumph. It was steady, like climbing a staircase in the dark, one step at a time, until suddenly you realize you're standing taller, breathing easier, looking down on the people who once loomed above you. And as the weeks went by, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't just planning to leave. I was preparing to return stronger than they ever imagined. And when I did, the people who once told me I wouldn't be noticed would learn just how wrong they had been. The rise gave me strength, but the setup gave me purpose. My name's James, I'm 36, and by the time I had rebuilt myself, financially, physically, and emotionally, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was plotting. It wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was justice. It was balance. It was finally putting the weight of my absence where it belonged, on the shoulders of those who swore they'd never feel it. The first shift came through work. My steady climb hadn't gone unnoticed, and when a senior manager announced he was retiring, I was offered the chance to step into a role that would have seemed unimaginable just a year before. More pay, more authority, more freedom. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Claire's father and brother laughed about my lack of ambition, I had quietly climbed higher than either of them knew. But I didn't brag. I didn't post about it. I let my silence do the heavy lifting. The less they knew, the more powerful I became. With the promotion came connections. I wasn't just sitting in my office anymore. I was meeting with clients, with other managers, with people who operated in circles far removed from the suffocating bubble of Claire's family. These were people who valued results, not appearances. People who didn't care about last names or who your father was. For the first time in my adult life, I realized how small Claire's family really was. In their world, Matt was king, but outside it, he was no one. And I, quiet, overlooked James, was becoming someone. I also tightened my financial net. That secret account I'd been feeding grew to the point where I could live comfortably without Claire or her family's knowledge. I spoke with an advisor, set up investments, and even looked into property in another town. I started spending weekends driving out to nearby cities. For work, I told Claire, but really I was scouting. I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, nothing flashy, but it was mine. I signed the lease under a name variation, my middle name first, last name second, so it wouldn't be obvious if anyone searched. It became my safe house, my fortress, the place I could slip into when the time was right. But the most important setup wasn't financial or professional. It was personal. During one of my trips, I reconnected with an old college friend, Daniel. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I told him, vaguely, that I was looking for a change, he listened without judgment. Daniel had built a consulting business and, as it turned out, had connections that overlapped with Matt's industry. Funny thing, he told me one night over drinks, "Your brother-in-law has a reputation. Flashy, reckless. People don't take him as seriously as he thinks." That stuck with me. For years, Matt had lorded his supposed success over me. But to people outside his family, he was already a joke. Daniel even hinted at projects Matt had botched, deals that had gone sideways, all hidden beneath his carefully polished image. That was when the idea crystallized. My revenge didn't need to be loud. I didn't need to scream, or confront, or demand acknowledgement. All I had to do was vanish, cleanly, completely, and let the cracks in their world widen without me there to absorb their cruelty. And when they inevitably looked for me, when they tried to drag me back into their orbit, they would find only silence. And silence, when you're used to mocking someone, is deafening. At home, I kept playing my part. I still attended dinners, still nodded at the jokes, still let Matt strut and her parents condescend. But inside, I was already gone. Every smile was rehearsed. Every thank you was hollow. They didn't know it, but they were laughing at a ghost. The setup also had another layer, one they couldn't see. I began documenting. Quietly, discreetly, I collected evidence of their words, their treatment of me, even the text messages I had found on Claire's phone. I wasn't planning to use them right away, but I knew, someday, I might need proof. Proof that I hadn't just imagined the years of humiliation. Proof that the jokes and concerns were daggers dressed as kindness. And if the day came when I had to defend my choices, those receipts would speak louder than anything I could say. The more I prepared, the calmer I felt. The anger that once burned in me had cooled into something sharper, resolve. I wasn't the same man they mocked at the barbecue. I was stronger, smarter, untethered from their approval. And while they continued to laugh in their small, insular world, I was stepping into something larger, something they couldn't touch. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I stared at the bare walls and whispered to myself, "They think you're invisible. Show them what invisible really means." And that's when I knew the setup was complete. The stage was ready. All that remained was the execution. Revenge isn't always fire and thunder. Sometimes it's the quietest storm, the kind you don't see forming until it's already washed everything away. My name's James, I'm 36, and by the time the stage was set, I didn't need to scream or confront anyone. All I had to do was disappear in the right way, at the right time, leaving behind just enough silence for their own words and actions to echo louder than anything I could say. The execution began the night of another family gathering, Labor Day weekend, a big barbecue at Claire's parents' house. I remember walking into that backyard and realizing I was already gone. Matt was holding court as usual, bragging about a deal he closed. Her parents were fussing over the grill. Claire was smiling that practiced smile she wore around them. No one noticed that I wasn't really there. Not emotionally. Not mentally. I was standing in the middle of their world and already outside it. I played along, of course. I laughed when I was supposed to, nodded when Matt smirked, held Claire's hand when she squeezed mine. But inside, I was counting down the minutes. I knew this would be the last time I'd stand among them like this. The last time I'd play the role they had written for me. When her father made another joke at my expense, James is proof Claire inherited my patience. I smiled politely and raised my glass. "You're right," I said calmly. "Patience pays off." They laughed, none the wiser. That night, when Claire went to bed, I slipped out of the house. Not with just a duffel bag this time. This time it was everything that mattered. The papers, the money, the keys to the apartment I'd been quietly maintaining. I left my wedding ring on the dresser, not in anger, but in clarity. A symbol of the role I had been forced into, returned to the stage it belonged to. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I didn't give them the satisfaction of drama. I simply vanished. The silence that followed was my revenge. Because silence, when you expect someone to absorb your cruelty, is devastating. The next day, the call started. Claire's name lit up my phone again and again. Then her mother. Then Matt. I didn't answer. Messages piled in. First confusion, then annoyance, then concern. "Where are you? This isn't funny." You're acting childish. And finally, the words that tasted sweeter than any I had ever read. We need you to come back. But I didn't. I stayed away. I poured myself into my new life, my job, my health, my friendships outside their orbit. And while I thrived in silence, they began to unravel. Through Daniel, my old friend with connections in Matt's industry, I heard whispers. Deals falling apart. Investors pulling out. Matt's empire wasn't as solid as he made it seem. And without me around to play the fool, to absorb the spotlight of mockery, the cracks in his image were harder to hide. Claire, too, began to falter. She reached out with long, pleading emails. We can fix this. They didn't mean it. Come home, James, please. But the words rang hollow, because I had seen her silence at that retirement dinner. I had read her lukewarm defenses in those messages. She hadn't stood by me when it mattered. Now she was standing alone, realizing too late that I had been the anchor she assumed would always be there. The most satisfying part wasn't their unraveling, though. It was the realization that I no longer needed their acknowledgement. My revenge wasn't in proving myself to them. It was in showing, through absence, that I had been the one holding more weight than they ever admitted. The family gatherings grew quieter without me, the laughter less sharp, the stories less grand. They had mocked me as invisible, but in my silence, I had become the shadow they couldn't escape. One evening, months later, I ran into an old acquaintance of Claire's parents at a grocery store in my new town. She didn't know I had left, didn't know the details, but she smiled and said, "Funny thing, your in-laws were at a dinner last week. They seemed smaller somehow, quieter, not their usual selves." I walked away from that conversation with a smile that didn't fade for hours. My revenge had worked. Without me to absorb their cruelty, they had nothing to sharpen themselves against. And the best part? They didn't even realize that I had planned it this way. To them, it looked like I'd simply cracked under the weight of their jokes and vanished. But the truth was sharper. I had built my exit piece by piece, until the moment I walked out was as smooth as closing a door. The silence I left behind was louder than anything I could have shouted. But of course, revenge doesn't end with the exit. It's in what comes after, when the people who thought they'd never miss you begin to realize they already do. And that's where the fallout truly begins. Fallout isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's slow, like watching a house rot from the foundation up. My name's James, I'm 36, and by the time my revenge settled into silence, the cracks in their world had widened into chasms they couldn't ignore. I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was stay gone. At first, their messages had been frantic. "James, where are you? This isn't like you. Come back, we can work through this." But weeks turned into months, and I never replied. Claire's emails grew longer, tinged with desperation. She admitted things I never thought I'd hear her say. That she should have defended me. That she'd let her family's voices drown out her own. That she had taken me for granted. By the third month, she wasn't asking me to come home anymore. She was begging. Her family's tone shifted, too. The proud, mocking voices became meek, cautious. Her father wrote me once, a short message. "We may have been too hard on you. I'd like to talk." That was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and it was almost laughable in its brevity. Matt, on the other hand, stayed true to form. His texts were half pleas, half threats. "You can't just run away. You think you're better than us? Grow up and come back." But behind the bravado, I knew he was unraveling. Through Daniel, I learned Matt's business had taken a serious hit. Without the constant buffer of someone to overshadow and ridicule, people had started noticing his flaws. Investors who once tolerated his arrogance pulled away when they realized there was no solid foundation behind his charm. Deals fell apart. His reputation, so carefully polished in front of his family, crumbled in the eyes of those who mattered. Matt had always needed a foil, someone to stand beneath him so he could look taller. Without me, he was just another arrogant man with nothing to back it up. Claire's parents suffered in their own way. They had built their social world on the illusion of a perfect family. The successful son, the strong daughter, the supportive in-laws. My absence became the crack they couldn't plaster over. People began asking questions. "Where's James? We haven't seen him in a while. How's your daughter's husband doing?" Each question was a reminder that I wasn't where they thought I should be, and they didn't have an answer. For a family obsessed with appearances, that was worse than anything I could have said to them directly. As for Claire, she spiraled. The woman who once laughed along with her family's jokes, who once brushed off my pain as sensitivity, was suddenly left facing her own silence. I know, because after nearly a year, she showed up at my apartment. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence deflated. She stood in the doorway, tears brimming in her eyes, and said, "I didn't realize until you were gone. You held us together. You held me together." I listened. I let her speak, let her pour out her regrets, her apologies, her promises to change. And for a moment, I felt the old ache in my chest, the part of me that had once loved her, that had once wanted so badly to believe she'd stand by me. But then I remembered the laughter at the barbecue, the silence at the retirement dinner, the messages where she had said he's trying, instead of he's enough. So I told her the truth, calmly, quietly, without anger. "I don't hate you, Claire, but you believe them more than you believed me, and I can't come back to that." Her tears fell then, and she whispered, "I thought you'd always be there." I shook my head. "That's the thing. You all thought I'd always be there. And now you see what life looks like without me." She left that night, and for the first time in years, I felt no guilt, only peace. In the months that followed, the calls dwindled, the emails slowed. Eventually, the silence wasn't just mine, it was theirs. Claire filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. I signed the papers without hesitation. Matt's business slipped further, until even his parents couldn't ignore his failures. Their family gatherings became smaller, quieter, stripped of the sharp laughter that had once filled the air. They had laughed at me, told me I'd vanish without a trace. Instead, it was their laughter that vanished, their certainty, their arrogance. And me? I built a new life, a better one where I wasn't invisible, where my worth wasn't measured by cruel jokes or comparisons to someone else. I found joy in friendships, fulfillment in work, strength in myself. The last time I saw any of them was by chance, at a cafe in the city. Claire sat at a table with her parents and Matt. Their faces looked tired, their voices muted. They didn't see me, but I saw them. And for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry. Almost. But then I remembered that night at the barbecue, the words that had started it all. "If you vanished tomorrow, no one would even notice." I smiled to myself, turned, and walked away. Because in the end, the truth was undeniable. I hadn't vanished. They had. And that was the final line of my story.